Zach, you're wanting to be your party's next leader. Do you think the Green Party ought to be doing much more to capitalise on the tricky difficulties that Labour's happening?
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity here. We've got a deepening inequality in our society. We had racist riots on our streets last summer, and of course, the nature and climate crisis. Labour are telling a story, but it's a story that's against people who need winter fuel payments, people living in child poverty, and actually they could be taxing multimillionaires and billionaires. And so I want to leave the Green Party because I think we have a strong story to tell that will absolutely capitalise and make sure that we're speaking for all the people in this country that want an alternative to this Labour government.
And that's the thing, right, is that I shared a clip on TikTok the other day of Yanis Varoufakis condemning the Liberal Democrats and pointing outright that the two kind of fulcrums on which progressive politics should really lie in the modern era is, first of all, opposing austerity politics, right? The fiscal prudence, quote unquote, of austerity that's been totally disproven has shown all around Europe to have created poor growth, a decrease in living standards, a failure to keep up with the expansionary policies coming out of the United States, for example. The austerity politics has failed. It absolutely has failed, and we need to oppose that. And obviously, with Labour doing things like cutting back on the welfare state, not looking at overall raising taxes, not just on high earners, but on middle-class people as well, who at the time we really only have a tax burden in the middle of the pack when it comes to the rest of the European countries do have good welfare states. These are all things that Labour haven't been good enough on in terms of where they're raising the overall tax base in the country. That's what we can oppose. And the second thing is about property rights. Is that anyone who opposes the transfer of property rights from the few to the many can't be treated as part of a progressive coalition. And again, that's not something that you're really seeing when it comes to the Labour Party. We're not seeing the kind of nationalisations that we want to see. We're not seeing the interest in things such as the inclusive ownership funds that they stood in the manifesto in 2019 to transfer ownership, at least partly, from companies from the owners to the workers, right? That should be the mainstay of progressive politics in the modern era. And if you can't challenge those, then you have to move out of the way so that we can actually redistribute power. Rather than just looking at taxation, which is fine. I think taxation is good. We need to get wealth out of the hands of the richest, and that's a good place to start. Broadly, it's about who owns what in society. People across this country are sick of big corporations owning everything, foreign states owning our national infrastructure, very few people in this country holding almost all of the wealth. These are the things that need to be opposed. These are the things that need changing, and that's the story the Green Party can tell you. Corporations really are the enemy. They destroy democracy by buying our politicians. They destroy our communities by pricing people out and pricing small businesses, for example, out of the places where they operate and the communities that they know. And they're destroying the environment by being the main polluters who are the ones who we need to take on. Okay? Those are the main three things that corporations do that are destroying the modern world in which we live and which everybody must oppose. And the Labour Party getting into bed with people like BlackRock by having these dinners, all these people who they refuse to tax, right, getting lobbied by places like Blackstone as well as JP Morgan Chase, who also lobbied Rachel Reeves to change rules about taxing wealthy banks and things like that. That is where the opposition must be. An opposition to the marrying of corporate power and governance.
Zach, do you have any sympathy for the position that the government is in? I mean, they did take over at a time when the economy had been battered because of Ukraine and because of COVID. Public services have had a hard time for a long time. When you look at what they're doing and the sort of straitjacket they're in, do you have any sympathy for them?
No, I don't think it's easy, but I think it's very simple. We actually need to tax wealth and not work. And you asked Angela Rayner several times at that beginning of the interview, will you tax wealthy people more? And she gave you some very small measures that are tinkering at the edges. Actually, if we put a wealth tax on assets of 1%, we could be raising billions of pounds.
But when they then leave, so you earn less money because all the wealthy leave.
Well, so it's actually a myth. There's a group called the Patriotic Millionaires, who are a group of wealthy individuals who are saying taxes more, because actually, no matter how rich you are, we all benefit from a more equal society.
There's quite a lot of evidence.
And that's the thing, right, is that the people who became fabulously wealthy in the United Kingdom did so off the back of a public realm that allowed them the infrastructure to be able to accumulate that wealth. Of course, they also accumulated that wealth off of the surplus value of the people that they employed, you know. So there is also that too. But regardless, even as the most moral business owner that you could possibly be, That wealth could not be accumulated without a functioning NHS to ensure your workers are healthy and able to do the job and be productive, without the roads with which your business relies on to be able to do things like freight, for example. It needs all of the public infrastructure spending on the education to ensure that people who you employ are well educated enough to do the job in the first place, right? All of the public realm that exists facilitated the accumulation of that wealth. You should be made to pay back into the replication and the reproduction of that public realm that helped you in the first place, right? Expecting to not have to pay back in, treating your accumulated wealth like it is solely down to you, right? Let alone the public realm, but also, as I said before, the surplus value of the actual productive labour that the people who you employed engaged in, that you've palmed off the top of and kept for yourself, not attributing those things to what made you wealthy in the first place is neoliberal brain rot. It's brain poison. And of course, nonsense. And therefore you should pay more back into the country. And of course, you cannot just accumulate all of the assets in the country and expect to not have to share that with everybody else, right? Assets have been subsumed by the super rich in this country. And first of all, when it comes to people leaving, if they're being taxed on their assets, they can't take their assets with them. They can't just pick up their houses and move them elsewhere and properties on the biggest kind of asset bubbles in this country. Nonsense.
And so that many very wealthy people have left the country. If you talk to anyone in the city, that's what they would tell you.
I mean, the evidence for this is one study that looked at people's locations on LinkedIn. Hardly bulletproof methodology.
And people who put forward suggestions of wealth taxes, when those things have been brought in before, they often don't deliver anything like what you might.
I mean, they did in Norway, and then they increased the wealth tax, and they also saw increased revenue from the wealth tax. Certain wealth taxes, even if they don't bring in a ton of cash, can also be good for facilitating the selling of assets, increasing vacancy rates. Exactly. It's about a redistribution of the assets out of an individual small class, the few, to be available for the many, for everybody else, rather than being entirely subsumed into a very, very small group of very, very wealthy people.
I hope.
Well, I'd refute that evidence, but I'd say more fundamentally, if people don't want to spend money in tax to our public services, then are they really contributing to our country? I'd say more widely on your question too. Angela Rayner talked about a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. I describe it as a genocide. And when we have a government that are ultimately complicit, in fact, actively participating by arming them, I think when the public watch interviews like that, it just feels completely disconnected from material reality. And that's both on domestic affairs, but also international affairs too. And I think both interviews are an example of why people are rejecting the two old parties, because they're seeing politicians say things that just materially aren't reality.
Is it fair?
And that's true, absolutely right. I mean, they are complicit in terms of the arms sales. When it comes to their active participation in the genocide, this is the reconnaissance flights being done for Israel by the UK from RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. Like, if you don't want to be seen to be complicit, stop the arms sales, stop the flights, impose the sanctions, break off diplomatic relationships. It's as simple as that. And don't let, for example, the subsidiaries of companies that are facilitating the illegal settlements in the West Bank from drilling for oil in Rosebank.
Fair, Imran, to say that the government's actively complicit in what's happening in Gaza?
I don't think you can say that about what the British government.
If you sell the parts for the jets that the country is using to commit the war crimes, then you're complicit. I'm sorry, this is basic international law. You do not sell weapons to people who are complicit in war crimes. That's simple, right? It is a violation to sell weapons to people who you suspect of breaking and violating international humanitarian law. That was the justification from David Lammy for the small number of arms licenses that were rescinded by the government. They kept giving out the arms licenses for F-35 jets that are being used in the genocide in Gaza. That is complicity. And that's before we even get to the flights from RAF Akrotiri.
Government is doing. And I think that, both Angela Rayner and Kemi Badenoch have tried to be as clear as they can about a situation in which terrible thing happened on October the 7th. I remember, speaking to friends of mine in the States where I live, and they said if someone had kidnapped and killed hundreds of Americans, we would boil the oceans to get those hostages back. And I believe them. I think the problem now is, of course, that in the zeal for both restitution to fix the problem, but also, I think, vengeance. Vengeance is an emotion that can lead to terrible, terrible things.
But it's not vengeance, though. It's not vengeance. The Likud party's explicit charter is that Israeli sovereignty is from the river to the sea. Right? That is part of the founding document of the Likud party, which is the largest party in the Israeli government and the party of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Right? Vengeance is, of course, a powerful motivator, but it is not vengeance that's causing them to wreak havoc in Gaza. It is the desire for conquest. A desire for conquest that has been the part of Israel's founding ideology of Zionism and explicitly laid out in the foundational document of the ruling party in Israel to this day. The reason why they're doing what they're doing is because they want the territory to expand Greater Israel as part of a long-term project. Attributing this to some kind of blind vengeance, laundering the reputation of Zionism and of the long-term desires of the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu.
And I would hope that starvation of civilian populations isn't seen as being vengeance, that it's only being, that any actions being taken by the Israeli government are to get those hostages back.
But they're not about vengeance or hostages. It's about ethnic cleansing. They're creating a humanitarian catastrophe deliberately because they want to force the Palestinians off the land so that they can colonize it, so that they can grab it, so that they can annex it, to ethnically cleanse them before they annex it, to maintain demographic majority, because it's all about ethnicity. It's all about ethnicity to these people. It is about creating a supremacist ethno-state. And you cannot do that if you do not maintain a demographic majority. They could annex Gaza at any point if they really wanted to, and they don't do it because they don't want to take in the population, because they don't want to share the Holy Land with Arabs. It's as simple as that. They want a demographic majority of Jews. That is specifically the ideology of Zionism and the creation of the ethno-state. It's why they won't annex the West Bank either, and why they continue corralling Palestinians into Area A, because they don't want to share a country with them, because they want to maintain demographic majority.
And there are many people, including Jews, including the two young people that Kemi Badenoch mentioned who were killed in Washington, D.C., the two young embassy staffers. Here's the great irony. They were killed while they were attending an event on how to bring humanitarian aid to Gaza through regional partners.
It's clearly a horrendous situation, and it's interesting to see how this government's position has evolved somewhat. Zach, let's stick with your pitch to be the Green leader. I mean, you took some of your colleagues by surprise, rather, I think, by coming out and saying that you wanted to be the leader. And when it comes to foreign affairs, we've picked up some unease about some of your views. I mean, you want to take the UK out of NATO, and you also reposted a video last year that claimed President Zelensky was asking for money after peace talks were blocked by Boris Johnson. That is not true.
By the way, this is a video by George the Poet, and it's like one line of a 4-minute video. It's incredible, the level that they will go to try and smear somebody, that they'll find a video from over a year ago that wasn't even theirs, it was somebody else's that they retweeted, and find one line they find objectionable. Now, I've seen contradicting reports around this potential peace deal that was scuppered by Boris Johnson. I'm not going to comment whether that's true or not, I don't know, right? But the very fact that there is some level to which that this is contested shows that you're really scraping the barrel if you're going to try and use this to try and smear Zach Polanski as some kind of Russian apologist, right? Especially when you're folding it into this criticism of him of leaving NATO, when of course he wants to build a European alliance instead. Trump is an unreliable ally, which is true. He shouldn't be an ally, and they are unreliable. That's not a controversial statement to make. Weird how they're going with this and not the hypno-boob stuff.
That was a wild claim. Is that the action of somebody who wants to be a responsible political leader?
I'm pleased you're asking me about this because it's important to correct the record. So on NATO, Donald Trump is threatening to annex Greenland. For those of us or people who support NATO, they've got to find a response to that. That would trigger Article 3. So are we going to go to war with America? I don't think anyone wants that. What I'm arguing for, and I think this is a pretty sensible position, is to say let's work with our European neighbours. Let's look at new alliances that are about diplomacy and peace. Why are we not spending money on books when our schools are crumbling? Why are we spending money on bombs? So ultimately what I'm talking about is creating alternative alliances. I've never said we need to leave immediately. That would severely be an unwise thing to do. What we do need to do is have the conversations right now about what do alternatives look like, recognising that Donald Trump is an incredibly unreliable partner that is saying he admires Vladimir Putin. And absolutely, we must stand with the Ukrainians too, in the same way that we stand with Palestinians.
And again, it's no word of a lie in anything that he said there. It can replace NATO. I mean, not immediately, of course. That's hardly going to be a short-term project, right? But in the long term, having the entirety of Europe acting as some kind of military base for American interests rather than having their own legitimate and defensive pact is surely what we would be rather having, rather than having to rely on, as Zach has rightly pointed out, somebody who is admiring of Vladimir Putin, someone who has clearly shown affinity for anti-democratic forces, as the person who is in control of huge amounts of military investment into Europe. And so essentially we're beholden to that guy. That's not a good situation to be in. That's before you even get to the historical position of NATO as a front for American imperial interests more broadly.
Talk about President Trump saying he admired Vladimir Putin. I want to take you back to that issue of a video that you reposted with untrue claims saying that President Zelensky was asking for money after Boris Johnson had blocked peace talks. That's not true. Is that the action of somebody who wants to be a prominent political leader in this country?
So the video was
wrong to do that.
The video was George the Poet endorsing the Green Party. It was about a 5-minute video, and this was one line in it. He was asking it as a question.
Did you not watch it before?
I think he phrased, do people have questions about what's happened? And I think we should always have questions about what Boris Johnson was doing in office. Ultimately, though, we do have to stand with Ukrainians in the same way we stand with the Palestinians, because any nation has a right to sovereignty.
But my question to you is, was it a mistake for you to repost that video? We live in an age of
Do you condemn George the Poet? Do you condemn retweeting George the Poet? This is crazy, right? We are already, not even been weeks or months even, since Zach declared his running for the leadership of the Green Party, and we're already getting peak Corbyn derangement syndrome of, do you condemn George the Poet in this one video you retweeted a year ago?
misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories online.
Yeah.
You want to be the leader of a big political...
I mean, this was hardly a conspiracy theory. This was reported on by Branko Marcetic, right? This is hardly something that's been spread as deliberate disinformation. It might have been an incorrect story that was reported on wrong, right? But it's hardly somebody who is a known disinformation peddler who was responsible for a lot of Western awareness about this.
Political party in this country. Was it a mistake for you to share that video?
This is the same question as kneecap right now. Ultimately, art should be protected.
I'm asking you a question.
It was a poet giving a poem. This isn't a political statement. It wasn't something I agreed with. This is a poet asking questions within a poem. I think we need to defend artists' free right of expression. And I think for people to ask questions within art is a perfectly legitimate place to be.
So you don't regret circulating a video that including an untrue claim about President Zelensky, the leader of a country that was invaded by Russia, asking for money, and also claiming that the former British Prime Minister had cancelled peace talks in a conflict?
It's an absurd line of questioning. Do I regret posting George the Poet, posting a poem, asking questions about international affairs? No, I don't.
So you don't regret doing it. And had you watched it all before you shared it?
Yeah, of course I watched the poem that I shared.
Okay. Jane,
I think ultimately, though, it's about pushing for peace and diplomacy and making sure that on all international affairs, we're standing to always talk about peace and you know, what are the alternatives we can make? Whereas far too often we see national politicians run straight to spending more money on bombs and military.
Jane,
Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.